been trying to avoid for months, fearful it would split the anti-Iraq coalition beyond repair. So little more than 24 hours after the Gulf War began, as the optimistic, euphoric words had scarcely died away, the entire tone had changed. Dwight Eisenhower once said, "Every war will astonish you," because he meant nothing goes as planned. But this much we can say. Tomorrow's New York Stock Exchange will not open with the lusty cheers of easy victory. Ted?
Much has been said and written, Jeff, about the short attention span of the American public. We're almost trapped in that kind of thing right now, and particularly with live television. Back in your youth, so long ago that neither one of us can remember it, you used to be a television critic. Comment for me for a moment now on what impact you think is being made by this extraordinary barrage of live television that's coming at us from 100 different directions.
Ted, it's astonishing. Over and over again, last night and today, you, the other anchors, have said, look, we don't know what's going to happen. It can be a long war. Take it easy. But the sheer volume of the pictures, the institutionalization of this war, almost as an ongoing television series in the first minutes, with graphics and promotional ads and music, makes it, in a sense, a kind of scripted event, even though, of course, it's not. And so in the first minutes, in the first hours, when we hear some good news, we don't hear the substantive warnings. We see the pictures, and we see them cheering on the stock exchange, and we almost think, well, all right, maybe 2 or 3 more days, but then there's a football game. And it's almost the kind of thing that for all our good intentions and our knowledge that this war could take a path that we don't know, we almost can't override the sheer volume of the pictures. It's an astonishing and, frankly, somewhat troublesome phenomenon.
If you'd be good enough, Jeff, stand by. We're going to be joined by some other guests now, and I'd like to get from them all the reaction of these events of the past 30 hours or so. It truly has been an extraordinary day and a half. Joining us, ABC analyst, commentator George Will, Congressman Steve Solars of New York, and Edward Luttwak, who is a military analyst and foreign policy specialist. First, if you can, and I know we've been talking about it for hours now, it seems, in terms of the foreign policy impact, talk about the impact on the American psyche, if you would. George?
Now, Ted, I think quite clearly the American people have been set up today for a giant mood swing. The news early today was that this was Grenada with better television, and it's clearly not going to be that way. And in fact, I think what you see today, Ted, no one said it yet, no one's even thought it yet, but I think the war aims are being radically redefined as war takes on its own momentum. I was fascinated by listening to Henry Kissinger say that our aim should be, and he gave a very rational understanding of it, equilibrium and a balance of power. Well, first of all, bombs and air forces are blunt instruments for fine-tuning the relations between nations. But beyond that, Ted, perhaps already, but certainly, if Saddam Hussein once uses gas, then you're going to trigger what the president some months ago talked about, which are war crimes trials. And that means, attendantly, an unconditional surrender gets built into the war aims that are already way beyond what the UN started with. So it seems to me that people are beginning to realize that if Saddam Hussein faces off against a superpower and survives, then after an armistice, if he is still in power, he's much enlarged and becomes the star player in, say, Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. That is unacceptable. This war, as I understand it, is not a war, Ted, of passion. It's a war of policy. We entered it with very measured tread and reluctantly. It's a war not just to make a dent in Saddam Hussein, but to make a point. And the point is that this kind of ruler is unacceptable. So it seems to me already, 20-some hours into this war, we now have effectively and de facto a war that has as its aim removal of that regime.
Congressman Solars, and let me caution you before you begin, we are going to have to take a break. This Nightline program, the special edition of Nightline, is going to come to an end, and then we will continue on with our special coverage. You will have plenty of opportunity, as will Ed Luttwak, to express your views, but if you can, this first response, keep it down to a minute and a half or so, if you would.
What's the question?
Well, I'd like you to react to what you've been hearing. It really isn't a question. I'd like to get your assessment of what's been going on in terms of its impact on the American psyche.
Ted, I think that if we win a decisive victory in the war against Iraq, which is a very real possibility, it will generate an enormous surge of self-confidence on the part of the American people. I think our objectives in this campaign are to eliminate a clear and present danger which Saddam has posed not only to the region but to the world. The missile attack against Israel earlier this evening should remove whatever lingering doubts there may be in the minds of anyone in our own country over the brutal and barbaric character of the regime in Baghdad. So at the end of this first day of the campaign, it's quite clear that it's not over. It has a way to go. There are clearly going to be casualties. There'll be downs as well as ups. But I think on balance, we can look forward to a decisive American victory.
Ed Luttwak, when I hear, and we're not going to have to take that break now, I'm told, so we're just going to continue with our coverage, but when I hear Steve Solar say it's not over, there are clearly going to be some ups and downs, nevertheless, the implication of that seems to be, the suggestion is that in some respects it is all over but the shouting, and yet this could still be a very long, a very bloody, and a very painful experience, couldn't it?
Well, if you want to measure the time, just take the numbers which have been published about sorties. Let's say you've flown 1,000 sorties. Let's say you've covered 1,000 targets. There are about 25, 30,000 targets. So what we are facing in the days ahead is bombing, day after day after day. And therein lies a danger. This evening, we have seen all the trauma that was inflicted on Israelis because of this theory here. This is the Middle East expert Peter Jennings' theory of great sensitivities in the Arab world. They're so sensitive in the Arab world that if the Israelis had taken precautions by removing those missiles concurrently, then the whole coalition would have broken up. The Saudis would have given up defense just because of that. The danger for us is that the same exaggerated sensitivities that are now removing crosses from our chaplains' lapels will cause the bombing to be interrupted prematurely. And then with the suggestion that from then on the ground forces can do it. Now, apparently 7 Israelis were wounded tonight, perhaps more. But there will be many more than 7 Americans who will be killed or wounded if we give in to this Middle Eastern sensitivity theory and cause it to interrupt our bombing. And then to say, let us push into Kuwait and use the ground forces, because then you have mines and you have everything else. So the thing now is to recognize that we're facing a 7, 10, 14-day war of pure bombing, and that can do the job.
You're saying that all it's going to take is the bombing, and what is it that you speculate is going to happen in Kuwait?
Dr. Kissinger said that the ideal strategic outcome leaves some kind of Iraq in place, because otherwise you have Congressman Solar has described the Iraqi regime as barbaric and brutal. Well, you have a brutal and barbaric regime in Syria. You have a brutal and barbaric regime in Iran. You have a barbaric regime in Saudi Arabia, a great ally. Now, in this world of barbarism and brutality, if you remove Iraq from the picture by annihilating the Iraqis, then you would release the Syrians to be as brutal as they wish instead of being constrained, and the Iranians. In this context, there is a way of using air power to achieve Dr. Kissinger's goal, and that is to use air power to cut off Iraq from Kuwait. That means flying lots of patrols. It's not easy, day and night, to intercept trucks bringing food to the Iraqi army in Kuwait, and then the odd van, and then the camels, and you starve out that army, you force it to withdraw. In the meantime, of course, you have bombed all these military factories, you have bombed all the offending chemical and missile and biological and everything else you want to bomb, and at the end of the day, you still have an Iraq in place. Let us not be carried away by emotion in this matter, because I agree Saddam Hussein is a very wicked man. But we have just seen the Saudi government, the government we protect, expel 700,000 innocent Yemenis, sending them on a desert road, robbing them beforehand. The very rich of the world robbing the poor. We have seen brutalities by the Syrian government. Let us not get carried away by emotion because of tonight's attack. It was a mistake, in my view, not to let the Israelis carry out their own preliminary attack on the Iraqi missiles. They would have done a better job, not because they're better pilots, but because they've been willing to take greater risks, because after all, it's their country, It is their lives.
Mr. Litvak,
we must not make the same mistake.
I'm afraid you're giving a bit of a long speech here now, and
Sorry,
I was really just trying to ask one question and get one quick response so that we can move around a little bit more. If I may, let me just go back to Congressman Solars again, because I cut him a little bit short. If you want to respond in any way to what anyone else has said, please go right ahead.
I thought the campaign might end by the time Dr. Litvak ended, so I'm glad you terminated his response, Ted, and we can get on with the discussion.
Well, go for it. Here's your chance.
Well, I think that for him to compare Saudi Arabia to Iraq is a little bit unfair to the Saudis. It's perhaps like comparing a delinquent to a serial murder. I fully agree that Iraq is not the only barbarous regime in the world or the region, but the difference is that in the case of Iraq, we had an evil regime which was on the march. Iraq has gone to war twice now in the last decade, first against Iran and then against Kuwait. And I think most Americans now realize that if we hadn't moved to stop Iraq now, we would inevitably have been obligated to stop Iraq later, but under circumstances where Baghdad would have been much more difficult and dangerous to deal with than it is at present.
George Will, there is a seductive quality to what Ed Litvak was talking about before, and that is do it from the air, do it from 20,000 feet, or for that matter from 500 feet as the jets come screaming in over the deck, but do it above all at the lowest possible human cost. Is it your impression that this can be achieved without those, and I must point out, the President has, after all, ordered 410,000 ground troops into the area, and that's not counting the 265,000 Allied troops that we have there. Presumably they're there because they're going to be used.
Well, obviously, in any civilized and democratic society, you want to economize the violence done to your own forces. But I think we're missing a point, and I can recur to this, the evolving, out-of-control evolving war ends that occurs during a war. We didn't start World War II with unconditional surrender as our objective, but it soon became that. And that really does rather suit the American character, and it very much suits a war begun with intermittent but rather frequent references to international law, war crimes, reparations, and all the rest. The military measures, Ted, sooner or later have to conform to the war aims, and the war aims are going to be driven in part by the military measures themselves. Will bombing from 20,000 feet or 200 feet change the regime in Baghdad? And it seems to me that is implicit in what we're talking about. It was said today, the President used in his meeting with, I believe, his cabinet members, the word surrender, and then said, well, I don't want to get involved in semantic dispute as well.
No, actually, it was Marlon Fitzwater who used the word surrender, and then the President sort of shied away from that.
Well, quite right. Now, but the President then went on to say what he needs to do is get out of Kuwait. Just imagine if 4 days from now, having stood up to and endured the pummeling of a superpower, he said, all right, I'm leaving Kuwait. Now, is that a satisfactory outcome? I'd like to hear the Congressman Solars on this. I don't think it is.
Well, I would consider it a satisfactory outcome, Ted, and I'll tell you why. Not only would we have achieved our objective in liberating Kuwait, but we would, in the process, also have destroyed Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction.
But, Congressman, would he not then emerge, A, enlarged, the oil flows out, the money flows in, he replaces the weaponry, and then where are you? This coalition, once dispersed, will not be easily reassembled.
I don't think he would have emerged enlarged, George. In fact, I think there's a real possibility under those circumstances that elements within his own military might very well take power into their own hands and overthrow him. But even if he survives politically, his military power would have been greatly diminished. In the way we would have demonstrated that aggression does not pay. The principle of concerted international action to uphold the sanctity of existing international borders would have been demonstrated. And I believe under those circumstances that this would be seen as a considerable victory for the coalition that has been arrayed against Iraq.
Congressman Solars, at the risk of incurring Ed Litvak's wrath by sounding a Peter Jennings-like line, I must tell you, I've just come back from the Middle East also. Have spoken to a number of Arabs in that region, and whether he wins or loses militarily, I'm speaking about Saddam Hussein, I'm telling you that he is going to emerge from this, alive or dead, as a gigantic figure, at least among the Arab man and woman on the street.
Well,
Ted,
Ted,
I
my main concern is not the extent to which Saddam Hussein, dead or alive, is a mythic figure. If you're right, no matter what the outcome, he'll be a mythic figure. My concern is whether he has the means and the wherewithal with which to advance his aggressive ambitions in the region as a whole. And as a result of what we will be accomplishing over the course of the next several days and perhaps weeks, through the destruction of much of his conventional military power and the decimation of his weapons of mass destruction, his ability to spread his evil in the region will be greatly diminished.
Congressman, he's 54 years old, isn't he? Are you willing to risk the stability of the region over the next 10 years on the possibility either that it will take him longer than that to regain his offensive and aggressive capacities, or that some dissident elements in Iraq, the evidence of which is non-existent, might overthrow him?
Well, George, first I thought you were arguing against elevating our war aims to include the removal of the regime. Now you seem to be arguing
No, I was not
in
arguing
favor of
against
it.
them. I'm saying that there's a dynamic at work here that is going to make them that.
Well, I don't know that they necessarily will reach that point. I think a lot may depend on the extent to which he, in fact, uses his chemical weapons or biological agents during the course of the conflict. If he does...
Excuse me.
Yes.
I'll try to intervene extremely briefly.
Thank you, Edward.
What will Syria be like? Let's assume that we remove Saddam Hussein, we obliterate Iraq. Tell me, as you know very well, Congressman Solars, Syria has been buying its own ballistic missiles. Syria has its own chemical warheads. Syria has its own biological warfare scheme. The reason why we have not been frightened of Syria is because Syria was the country that was under the dangling Iraqi sword. Now, let us now imagine a Middle East without Iraq, totally blown away. What will then Syria look like? Is Syria free of the Iraqi counter-threat? Indeed, what will Iran look like? How about Saudi Arabia, which has its own IRBMs, as you know?
Edward, if your point is that a victory for the coalition in the war against Iraq does not eliminate every other problem in the region, I don't think anybody would argue with
that
you.
is not my argument.
But it will solve the problem we face right now, which is the threat posed by Iraq to the other countries in the Gulf.
My argument is not that it will eliminate every other threat. It is that it will aggravate all these existing and very serious threats. You take out the Iraqi threat, and if you tell me it's the most serious, I accept that. But in exchange for the Iraqi threat gone, you have the Syrian threat, and indeed, if you like, the Saudi threat increased. And by the way, let me say why I keep mentioning Saudis. Even as we speak, there is Saudi money going out all over the Muslim world to finance and encourage the most radical Islamic groups that attack American and Western interests everywhere. All these young men with beards who go to these new Saudi-built mosques, they are not, you don't classify them as terrorists, but they're causing just as much harm, all the way from Morocco to Malaya. We have to, I think, as we contemplate the horrors of Saddam Hussein, we have to be realistic about this. And I think Ted is quite right in saying that the man could become a hero. But that is not our guide either. Because after all, in the Middle East, if you kill some infidels, you automatically become a hero because the number of the faithful that also get killed don't count because they go up to heaven. There's a religious logic here that we can never defeat.
Gentlemen, let me ask you all one more question, and then we're going to bring this particular segment to a close and continue on with the rest of our coverage. And I hope we'll be able to go live to Dahran in eastern Saudi Arabia and get a sense of what is happening there now tonight. One more question to each of you, and George, I'd like to pose it first to you. If America ultimately, and if the Allies ultimately win, what does that do in terms of establishing the United States indisputably then, not only as the global superpower, but also as the regional superpower?
Ted, you say if America wins. One of the oddities of this war that we entered with, as I say, such measured tread and with such notable reluctance and absence of passion is that the outcome is not in doubt, the military outcome. The political outcome afterwards, no one can tell. But militarily, Saddam Hussein knows, and we know, that if the war goes to a military conclusion, as opposed to a political armistice, we win. Now,
let me interrupt you, George, because I'm not sure I can accept that, and let me explain to you why. Saddam Hussein has said on numerous occasions I heard it said to me again through someone with whom he had spoken only a few weeks ago. I can accept, says Saddam Hussein, 200,000 dead. Iraq will accept that. The United States, after they have 10,000 dead or 15,000 dead, they can't handle it. I'm not as sure as you are that this can necessarily be won militarily if indeed it goes to a ground war, and if indeed it is a protracted war, and if indeed there are high casualties.
I think there might be a period of extraordinary recrimination and recoil, but I think America would win it. I think that is the real lesson of American history. Someone should send Saddam Hussein the PBS series on the Civil War. America has a history of taking casualties, but let's hope it doesn't come to that. As to your question, the premise of this war, and then the logic behind the rather vacuous phrase New World Order, is that with the Soviet Union gone, we're now entering a period in which wars will be made obsolete by perhaps the example of this one, and therefore we will enter a rule-making period where rules will be written, and the United States sword, being the mightiest in the world, will guarantee that the United States pen will be the one that predominates in the writing of the rules. In that sense, I think it's not an irrational hope that the President has that this can be not the end of a particular period, but the beginning of one.
Well, gentlemen, let me just interrupt my own question in your answer to read you an urgent that has just moved over from Reuters from Jerusalem. I'll read you the whole story. It's relatively short. Lieutenant General Dan Shomron, Israel's chief of staff, said on Friday that Iraqi missile attacks cannot go without a response. Such an incident requires a response, he told Israeli television. He was asked whether Israel could respond in view of the need of its U.S. ally to maintain an anti-Iraqi Arab coalition with Arab partners. Shomron replied, I want to say the great American ability does not alter the principle that the protection of the civilians of Israel is the responsibility of the state of Israel, and we have the ability to respond. And I said this incident cannot go without a response. Does that mean Israel will respond, he was asked. I think it's still understandable that I don't intend to enter into the details. Do you think that has changed anything that we have heard, Congressman Solars, up until now?
Not really, Ted. I think most Americans would agree that Israel clearly has a right to respond. Whether Israel chooses to respond, and if so, when and how, is a matter the Israelis will have to determine for themselves. But of one thing I am relatively confident. If Israel should choose to retaliate for this Iraqi attack against them, I believe the coalition will hold together. Both Egypt and Saudi Arabia have previously indicated that they would understand if Israel responded to an Iraqi attack against them. And I believe that both King Fahd of Saudi Arabia and President Mubarak of Egypt understand very well that it is Iraq rather than Israel that poses the most serious threat to them. Their primary concern is not with Shamir but with Saddam, and therefore I believe they will continue to work with us in this campaign, which is now underway, which has gotten off to a rather extraordinary beginning, designed to deprive Saddam Hussein of the conventional military power and the weapons of mass destruction to terrorize and ultimately to overrun the other countries in the region.
All right, gentlemen, but please, I beg you somewhat shorter answers, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to bring this to a conclusion.
Ted,
yes.
Very quickly, if the account you just read us implies that the Israelis believe that the launchers which sent off those missiles are now being reloaded. It's a slow process, 6 to 8 hours with liquid fuel, and perhaps moved and then reloaded and are liable to launch another lot of missiles. At that point, for the Israelis, it's a case of having their best effort look at finding them. A piece of diplomacy could be of great help. Jordan has U.S.-built Hawk missiles supplied to it. King Hussein of Jordan is supposed to be the great and good friend of President Bush and son. This may be the time to make phone calls in order to facilitate passage, because although the Israelis, as we all know from the map, can fly around Jordan, that means losing range and therefore losing the ability to fly and search. Hard enough to do anyway. But I think that if the Shomron statement is what it appears to be, it means that they have decided that they cannot, in fact, rely on other people's bombing to take out these launches, which are, of course, very isolated from all other targets in Iraq.
All right, George Will, your response to the Shomron statement.
A two-sentence answer, Ted. Any nation has a right to self-defense. Israel, the national gathering of the Jewish people born out of the Holocaust, has a peculiar integrity and a peculiar imperative to look after its own self-defense.
George Will, Ed Luttwak, and Congressman Steve Solars. If you'd be good enough to stand by, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll be going live to Israel. Back in a moment.
ABC News coverage of the Gulf War will continue after these messages. Washington, Ted Koppel.
It is now early Friday morning in Israel, and standing by is ABC correspondent Dean Reynolds. Dean, a couple of relatively late statements from senior Israeli officials suggesting that apparently the decision has not yet been made whether or not to respond directly to Iraq's attack on Tel Aviv and Haifa earlier today.
Ted, military censorship prohibits me really from getting into that subject. So I'd prefer not to get into it, although I think the Chief of Staff statement speaks for itself.
Well, I don't want to put you into a more difficult position than you're already in, but the Chief of Staff's statement suggests that the Israelis are still reserving the right to act. I'm a little bit inhibited now in terms of what I can... Well, I'm going to ask you whatever I want to ask you, and then you answer or don't answer based upon your own conscience or based upon the restrictions that are upon you. Do you get the impression that something is about to happen?
I don't think there would be any surprise. It should not come as a surprise to us. The Israelis have made it clear over and over again during the 5 months of this crisis, if attacked, we will respond. It shouldn't come as a surprise to Saddam Hussein. It shouldn't come as a surprise to the Americans. And it won't come as a surprise to the Israeli people if, in fact, that happens.
All right, joining us also by telephone is Dan Patir, who was once the chief spokesman for the Israeli government. Dan, what are you doing these days other than writing a book?
These days I'm listening to your program, Ted.
We can almost hear you there. If someone can goose up the volume a little bit. Dan, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Now we can hear you very well, too. Do you get the impression, you're a private citizen now, so you can speak a little more freely. Do you get the impression that Israel is going to respond militarily?
I'm not privy to the to operational decisions, but the mood, I think, in Israel has been well reflected by what the Chief of Staff just said on Israel television. After all, the impact of sustaining direct hits of several missiles in this context, in my feeling, cannot go on without Israel really manifesting its right to self-defense.
All right, I get the impression, and Dan, I hope you'll forgive me because I know you've been hanging on for a long time. We have a terrible telephone connection with you and can barely hear you, and I rather suspect our audience can't understand what you're saying, but I got the strong impression that Dan Patir was saying that he does not see how it'll be possible for Israel not to respond to that Iraqi attack. Dean, before we go, and we're going to be taking a break in about a minute and a half, you were suggesting before that you are in one form or another subject to Israeli censorship right now. I'd just like you to explain what the parameters of that censorship are.
Well, Ted, we have information that the Israelis prefer that we not disclose. I'm really in an awkward position.
No,
here.
I don't want you to get into something that you feel you cannot say. I just want to understand what the rules of censorship are.
Well, the rules usually are if someone's life is in danger, if information is disclosed. I mean, it's kind of like the American military as well, although the Israelis, I think, encounter the situation more often than the Israeli military. The Israelis encounter it more often than the American military does because they're frequently engaged in one form of military action or another, specifically raids against terrorist targets in southern Lebanon.
All right. I think we get the thrust of it, Dean. We've got to take a break. I thank you very much. We're going to be back with ABC's continuing coverage, but we're going to take
relatively open country. The West Bank and Gaza are under curfew, and we're not allowed to go into those areas, although they have been quiet through the last couple of days. In the Tel Aviv area, our crews have been on the scene of the heaviest damage of the explosions this morning. We've talked to people. The government is a little, is not quite as accessible as it usually is. Obviously, they're now in virtually a state of war, and there are security measures to be taken.
And there are big decisions to be made, too, I'm sure, Larry, as you're indicating. Thank you. We'll be back to you in a little while. Just point out that the Israeli Chief of Staff today said that the Iraqi missile attack cannot really go without a response. We'll stand by and see where that dispatch we had from Israel. Of course, we've been waiting to see whether the Israeli government's going to decide to retaliate for the Iraqi missile attacks against Israel, missiles that hit in Haifa and in Tel Aviv, causing light casualties and damages overnight. The Chief of Staff of the Israeli Armed Forces, that's General Dan Shomron, is quoted as saying that this kind of an attack, quote, cannot go without a response. Such an incident requires a response, but that does not mean that the response has to come right now. So again, through this day, the Israelis have a lot of very important military but also political decisions to make, because a lot is at stake in terms of this coalition. Although those of you who have been with us throughout the evening with Tom Brokaw and his discussions with various experts probably recall that one of the themes that has been arising today is that even if the Israelis were to respond with a limited attack, let us say that is with some of their missiles, Jericho missiles targeted at Iraqi targets, and not send Israeli planes in, piloted aircraft, that perhaps that would mitigate a bit of the Israeli response. And therefore the coalition, the alliance, would not be bruised, would not fall apart. The other factor really to keep in mind here is that the Israelis understand full well, I mean, they are perhaps the paramount military specialists in that part of the region, of the importance of keeping this coalition together, and also of just how well the airstrikes are working right now against Iraq. And as Henry Kissinger said earlier on our NBC coverage, one of the things you want to make sure of right now is that you're not thrown off course. If things are going so well so far, keep on that course, and that, of course, is what the White House has no doubt been telling the Israelis this evening, but the Israelis are fully capable of understanding that themselves, so we shall see. Let's now go over to Arthur Kent, who is in Saudi Arabia, standing by. Arthur, we're really going back and forth between the Israeli story and what's happening there this morning in Saudi Arabia. What do you have for us?
Well, Garrick, we have nothing official, of course. The last thing that we will see is official pronouncements on how the raid last night on Israel might affect the relationship of the various Arab and Western partners to this U.S.-led anti-Iraq coalition. But we can tell you that the Saudis and the Kuwaitis in particular, who participated a great deal in yesterday's strikes against military targets in Iraq and Kuwait, will be very eager not to read into this situation anything which would break up the unity of the alliance that has, according to Pentagon sources, done so well against targets in those two countries. Saudi Arabia, of course, put forward about 150 aircraft in the early stages, in the first two waves of the attacks. The Kuwaitis put the remnants of the Kuwaiti Air Force up in the air yesterday and actually lost a jet shot down by Iraqi anti-aircraft fire. So it'll be very interesting today to try to pick up in the Saudi press, official pronouncements here, any sort of rumblings which might indicate disquiet. But we don't predict it unless Israel goes to an extreme retaliatory strike against Iraq.
Well, Arthur, to follow up on that point, I think one of the things we should really point out is that although the Arab nations have been by and large united against Israel, with the exception of Egypt, which has established diplomatic relations with the Israeli government, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are not what they call in the Middle East or the Arab world front-line confrontation states. That is basically Syria, which has occupied that role. Syria just fought a number of wars with the Israelis and come out on at the short end of the stick on most of those wars. Do you have any indication there as to whether the Saudis are concerned about Hafez al-Assad and the Syrians, whether they might weaken a bit if the Israelis were to respond?
Very interesting question, Garrick. I mean, the dynamics now of Arab politics within this region, now that Saddam Hussein, the strong man who occupied a locus between so many competing powers, not only Syria and Saudi Arabia, but Iran to the east, seems to be on the way down, seems to be about to be eliminated. We cannot read too much into what we've heard here because, of course, the Saudi royal family, which dominates the governing elite in Saudi Arabia, has played very close to its chest exactly how the new order of Arab politics might be once Saddam is removed. But we can tell you that in these preliminary stages, the priority for the Saudi government has been, to the relief of Washington thus far and the Bush administration, a show of solidarity, both in the skies over Iraq and Kuwait, and in political statements, continuing condemnation of Saddam. And again, if Israel does not react with too much force, if it does not overreact to these strikes last night, it will tend to play down any kind of disunity that results from any statements or actions taken by Israel in the forthcoming days.
Okay, Arthur Kent, thank you for that fill-in. But before you go from the heavy matters of the moment to something perhaps a little bit lighter, but I'm sure people are curious about it, the morning weather forecast, please, there in Saudi Arabia. What's it like? We see there is sun. How warm?
Again, another surprise. The desert brings them, puts them to you almost daily. Overcast only an hour ago, and now a bright, bright sun scorching through. We're back down to a shirt sleeve weather on the ground. Clear skies for aircraft taking off out of their bases in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, off the aircraft carriers out in the Red Sea and in the Gulf. We can only guess, but that this weather pattern holds true for Kuwait, some 250 miles north of here. It's going to aid them, obviously. It will also be another day in daylight operations of testing whether that Iraqi Air Force is indeed completely suppressed, whether air defenses, as the Scuds did last night, will provide U.S. and coalition aircraft with any surprises when they close on their targets today.
All right, Arthur Kent, thank you very much. In Saudi Arabia, and of course, those clear blue skies are going to be important not just for the Air Force and Navy pilots headed north. It's also good news for those people who have to read and analyze the satellite pictures that are being sent back, have been sent back since the daybreak broke after the first wave of air attacks. And that's something that the Pentagon has been concentrating on, and Jamie Gangel has taken over there. Good evening, Jamie.
Good, I think it's good morning.
Good morning,
Garrick,
I should say. It depends what part of the country you are in. But do you have any indication as to what the satisfaction level might be in terms of the satellite reports they're getting back? I mean, there must be hundreds or thousands of them they have to go through.
They're certainly going through that now, getting battle assessments. But I just want to go back for a second to one thing that Arthur was talking about with these Scuds. What we're being told here repeatedly, Garrick, is to be cautious and remember that this can happen again. Although they took out a lot of the hard-based Scud missiles, the word here is that for these mobile base missiles that can move around, the Scuds, that at best maybe 20 or 30% were taken out. And so there's still a lot of concern, and again stress that what happened tonight in both Israel and Iran can happen again.
If we look not just at the issue of the Scuds, but just the issue of another aspect of this war, which is information flow. Now, I'm sure people have been watching our program, following the events. They're staying up late in many parts of the country. Any indication as to when we're going to get another dose of plain old-fashioned information as to what's happening?
It's tough. The next briefing will be at 7 a.m. East Coast time. That will be by General Schwarzkopf from Saudi Arabia. One of the things that was stressed to me tonight by a senior Pentagon official who had been doing very much the same thing during the Panama invasion was that there everything was on about the same time frame. Here we have an 8-hour difference between the East Coast and Saudi Arabia. Then you have troops that are even further further out so that the base in Saudi is waiting for reports to come back from all over the desert and front lines there. So there's quite a bit of lag time, and that's very frustrating here. Frequently, they're hearing about things first, frankly, by watching us on television.
When we talk about information and about briefings, it'll be interesting to see and hear General Schwarzkopf. He's a man I think most or many Americans have become well familiar with, not only a very experienced combat leader, a combat officer, but a man of a particular turn of mind. And from the Pentagon side, the man in uniform we've been seeing most often is General Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Do you think the Pentagon will start to be bringing other uniformed senior officers out to brief the public and the press, or are they going to stick with Powell and Schwarzkopf?
Well, we're hearing, in fact, that Tom Kelly, who's number 2 at the Joint Chiefs, will be doing some briefing tomorrow, so we will see some other people coming in. But the fact of the matter is that both General Powell and Schwarzkopf are very impressive. They've come across very well. The building is clearly comfortable with them. The White House is clearly very comfortable with the job that they've been doing, so I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of both of them.
All right. Thank you very much, Jamie Gangel at the Pentagon. Interesting aspect about General Schwarzkopf, of course, he has a very distinguished career. He also has a great deal of family experience in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf region. His father served the U.S. government as an advisor to Iran many years ago. This is before the present regime, the successors of Ayatollah Khomeini, came to power there. He was an advisor on police and security matters. So General Schwarzkopf grew up in a family which was aware of and sensitive to the various dynamics, the forces at play in the Middle East. And several weeks ago, shortly after he arrived there, in fact, he gave an interview which was interesting, showed that he had a political insight as well as military experience, saying that we must be careful not to destroy Iraq, not to destroy its military forces, because that would create instability, a vacuum. That's one of the things we've been talking about with Gary Sick, who is back with us, among others, that General Schwarzkopf, a military man, has this kind of touch, so to speak, for the area, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. And that's really very, I should think, reassuring for all of us, to think that we have military men, and having been a military man, I have a certain sense about that. But to find people that are scholars in uniform, people who know something about the area that they're working in, and who are, in fact, sensitive to political issues as well, and I think that's a wonderful choice for our commander there.
And we have it not only in General Schwarzkopf, who's the man on the ground there, we also have it in Colin Powell, four-star general, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was National Security Advisor.
And before that, we had it with Bill Crow, the Admiral Crow, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a PhD from Princeton, political scientist, long political experience as well. I mean,
so in a way, the job description for the jobs at the top of the military ladder has been going through some evolution, hasn't it?
I think it really has, yes. I mean,
now, Gary Sick, you worked for several years in the National Security Council at the White House, really concerning yourself with affairs in Iraq, Iran, the Persian Gulf area. People who really follow this, look at this, we see a Jim Baker, we see a Dick Cheney out there, but just below this, these top officials, what's happening there in the White House these days, in that National Security Council area? We see very often the lights burning late in Brent Scowcroft's office there in the corner in the West Wing. Gives a bit of the atmosphere.
Well, they work almost as hard as you journalists.
Probably a lot harder. I hope they know a lot more, too.
Usually not, unfortunately. And that's one of the things that I think is most surprising to people on the outside, is that you think that these people must have all of this wonderful information at hand, fingertip feel for everything. Well, they have a lot of classified information that you and I don't have to work with, but 99% of the really important information is the stuff that is known, if not that day, is known within a day or two, and you can put it together in the political analysis and the like. I found, frankly, with virtually all of the intelligence information of the government available to me, that I ended up relying on press reports, news reports from around the world, the kind of thing that not everybody just reads, but which is basically unclassified, as was the most insightful. A full text of a speech by a foreign leader is worth more than a secret report of a third-hand report of a conversation that he had that is reporting. I mean, this sort of speaks for itself. Here is some of the aftermath of the attack. Can you tell anything from that shrapnel, from those large pieces of metal lying there?
Well, as far as I can tell, these are pieces of the missile. We don't see enough there to assess what the actual damage was. But as far as I know, the damage was relatively marginal. A couple of single or two-story buildings were hit. As we see right now, the damage is very marginal. As we know from the number of casualties, thank God no loss of life, it justifies what we expected before, that when it comes to conventional warheads, these missiles are not so dangerous. But when it comes to other warheads, it's a different ballgame.
Now, it has been said often, Colonel Dromi, that one of the reasons that, at least with conventional warheads, these missiles are so ineffective is that the Iraqis have modified the Scuds, that they have lightened the payload in order to lengthen the range of the missile. Could you talk about that for a moment?
Well, it doesn't make much difference because finally this missile cannot really carry a lot of TNT, a lot of detonative stuff. And it was said that it can carry between, say, 400 to 1,000 pounds of TNT, which is much less than a regular bomb that an aircraft can carry. And an aircraft, as we know, can carry a couple of bombs. So here's probably the impact, the point of impact, where the missile have touched the ground and exploded. As we can see, there is this crater, but a couple of yards away from the crater, I don't see much damage. I also see some people laughing there. I hope they're laughing out of satisfaction that so few people were hurt.
Let me just ask you this, Colonel Dromi. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. What's the point, then, of these Scud missiles if they are as ineffective as you suggest and as ineffective as they appear to be? I mean, a certain amount of luck, obviously, is involved that a large number of people were not killed. I would assume if that Scud missile had fallen on a shopping center, let's say, a great many people would have been killed.
Well, still, you don't decide war with these kind of missiles. We have the experience of World War II, where Great Britain was attacked ceaselessly by the Germans for years, not for one shot, and still prevailed and survived. What's the point? I don't know. What's the point of all this war initiated by Saddam Hussein? I don't know. We're probably not talking on the same levels of rational thinking.
Well, I suppose it would be totally rational if indeed the state of Israel decides to respond. You're no longer in the Air Force, right?
Right. I retired last year.
All right, so you can speculate with the best or the least of us. You know your government and you know your former military comrades there. Israel almost never sustains any kind of military action, be it a terrorist action or a military action initiated by another state, without responding. Can you, in fact, think of a single instance where the state of Israel has not responded?
Well, I can recall some incident before the Six-Day War when some bomb or a hand grenade exploded in Jerusalem, and then the Prime Minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol, said, the notebook is open and the hand is writing, meaning we will respond and will retaliate, but at our own choosing, at the timing that we wish, and the way and the tactics. I think that's the core of what comes out of what the Deputy Foreign Minister Netanyahu said, and also the Chief of Staff. They both said, of course, Israel has the right to retaliate. I think it's justifiable. I think it's justifiable. It's necessary even for the benefit of the long-range relations between Arabs and Israelis, that all the Arabs who entertain these kind of thoughts about that you can deal with Israel with means of force should know better and should rather adopt the example of the late President Sadat, who said enough with this. So I would say yes, Israel can retaliate. I don't know if it will. Ted, we had enough speculations lately. I think we had too few hard facts around. So I'd rather wait and see, but I'm confident that if Israel will decide to retaliate, our colleagues from the Air Force will do the best. And by the way, Ted, may I take the opportunity to tell you as an Israeli Air Force colonel in the reserve that I have the highest admiration to what your people here of the armed forces achieved in the beginning of this campaign. You know, it's really magnificent. I wasn't surprised by this. I was surprised by the very small ratio of casualties. I think all the compliments should go to the people who developed the weapon systems, who maintained the aircraft, the people who planned this so complicated battle plan, and of course the people who flew it. I'm impressed.
All right. Well, Colonel Dromi, as you know, sometimes there are tensions between the U.S. government and the Israeli government, but I know that the level of esteem that the U.S. military has for the Israeli military is such that that kind of compliment, I'm sure, will be appreciated. There is some late video that has just come in now from Tel Aviv, a couple of minutes of video. Let's just take a look at that.
In the neighborhood where a missile came down, but it didn't explode, thanks God. And it fell apart into a few parts. Here, I mean, is a part of the engine. Then I'm now going to see two houses where it hit, but thanks God, no casualties, no wounded. I want just to speak to the people and to calm them down. Okay, be well.
That was the mayor of Tel Aviv, as you just saw, and here now is some late video that's just come in with some shots of, there is some really minimal damage, I guess, that was caused to one of the houses. The point here being, however, that this Scud missile, or at least pieces of the shrapnel, apparently hit what is clearly a residential area of Tel Aviv.
We heard a big noise. 2 minutes after we get to the closed room, there was a small noise, and after that a big one, and we heard crash glasses, crash windows. We thought that the windows in the house broke, and after an hour when they tell us in the news that we can take off the mask, we get out from the room, and we saw what happened in the room.
And here now, apparently, some of the injured. I should point out, we haven't had a chance to look at this video yet. It was just satellited in from Tel Aviv, but apparently some of the injured. The number that we have heard, either 6 or 7 people injured, no indication of how seriously, although this person is still ambulatory, being walked into a Tel Aviv hospital for treatment. And it appears that the Israelis got away relatively unscathed this time. One observation as we're watching this video, even here where the damage was mercifully small and the level of injury was low, even here you get a sense of the horror of aerial bombardment against the civilian population. If I may, I'd just like to make the observation that for all the military targets that are being taken out, a lot of very frightened civilians who are undergoing a lot of terror these days in Baghdad. I'm not suggesting that any of those air raids are unjustified, and indeed the point needs to be made that great effort is taken, sometimes at great personal cost to American pilots, to make sure that civilian targets are not hit. But there is a tendency somehow to dehumanize our enemy, and I think it's only appropriate that we remember that there are men, women, and children in Baghdad who are terribly frightened tonight, and who are frightened not only of the attack being launched against them by the Allied forces, but frightened also of their own government and Saddam Hussein. We must always be careful not to confuse them with the enemy. Still standing by in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem now is Dean Reynolds. Dean, any late information?
Ted, the number of casualties, according to Israeli radio this morning, is 12 light to medium injuries. 12 people wounded with light to medium injuries. Some of them were suffering from shock. You can see from the videotape that the damage was light, although the area that was hit by at least one of the missiles was an older area where the buildings were not terribly well fortified. And if you've seen some of the stuff that I have seen, it is very fortunate for the Israelis that there weren't more serious injuries. I should point out, Ted, that today is Friday, the Muslim Sabbath, and the Palestinians on the West Bank are under curfew, as well as those in Gaza are under curfew. The first soundings that we have from those areas today is that this missile attack by the Iraqis, as you pointed out earlier, will probably turn Saddam Hussein into a mythic hero among the Palestinians. Their support for him, of course, has left a lot of Westerners shaking their heads as to why they would back what appeared to all of us to be a certain loser. I think it is really a measure of the depth of both the Palestinian despair in their situation and also their loathing for the occupation. I pointed out the fact that it's Friday Prayer Day today because very few of those folks in the West Bank and in Gaza will be making their way to Jerusalem because they're under curfew, and we are likely to see only the most elderly Palestinians from East Jerusalem getting into the Al-Aqsa Mosque this morning.
Dean, let me just interrupt for a moment to point out, I'll keep talking to you until we lose the satellite, but we are about to lose our satellite to Jerusalem. I understand that Yitzhak Shamir has summoned his cabinet and that they are going to be discussing the issue of whether or not, and if, how, to respond to the Iraqi bombing of Tel Aviv today.
That's correct. Again, we don't know whether that would be a post-mortem on what has already transpired or a meeting to decide exactly what to do. But again, as you heard from the Chief of Staff, that this kind of attack cannot go without a response. The American-led anti-Iraq coalition notwithstanding.
All right, Dean Reynolds, anything you want to add before we lose you electronically?
Ted, it is a beautiful morning in Jerusalem. The sun is up. The streets are empty. The all clear has not been sounded here, nor in Tel Aviv, or in Haifa, or for that matter, anywhere in the country. But for right now, it is quiet.
And you and an awful lot of Israelis got some heavy active practice in how to put on those gas masks, right?
That's right. That was one of the eerier experiences of my life, to go into a room with your friends donning gas masks, thinking the unthinkable is actually underway.
It focuses the mind, doesn't it?
It does indeed, Ted.
All right, Dean Reynolds, thanks very much for your help throughout the evening, and we'll be talking to you, I'm sure, later in our day and later in yours, too. Thanks very much. To bring you up to date with events at this hour, it is now well past 1 a.m. here in the eastern, in fact, it's almost 1:30 here in the eastern part of the United States. That's after 9 in the morning in Baghdad. ABC's Pentagon correspondent Bob Zelnick reports that a second U.S. Navy jet is missing and feared lost over Iraq. No more details on the type of plane or if the pilot survived. Allied bombing missions have continued pounding Iraqi targets throughout the day. The major story of the day so far has been the Iraqi missile attack on Israel. Between 8 to 10 Scud missiles hit the area from Haifa to Tel Aviv. There were no fatalities reported. None of the missiles carried chemical agents. There is also a report that another Scud missile was launched against Saudi Arabia, but it was destroyed by a U.S. Army surface-to-air missile before it reached its target. And a senior military official in Amman said the Jordanian army was placed on its highest state of alert since the 1967 Six-Day War, fearing an Israeli response to the Iraqi missile attack. Jordanian authorities said they expected a severe Israeli response, but as of this hour, there has been no retaliation. However, the Israeli military chief of staff said the attack cannot go without a response, and as you just heard me discussing with Dean Reynolds, the Israeli cabinet is now meeting. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more of our continuing operation of Operation Desert Storm and some of its repercussions.
ABC News coverage of the Gulf War will continue after these messages.
Now learn to read with Hooked on Phonics. Because Hooked on Phonics is set to music, the right and left brain work together with dramatic reading results. After learning one 18-minute lesson, it's possible to read book one, over 120 pages. So for the beginner or anyone needing reading help, get Hooked on Phonics and learn to read. Call 1-800-ABCDEFG, 1-800-ABCDEFG.
Know where I am? I'm at one of the finest resorts in the world. I love it because everything is right here. I can relax in the sun, eat marvelous food, enjoy a room with an ocean view. There's fabulous entertainment, friendly service, and it's all included in the price. But what makes this resort really fun is that it takes me to some of the world's other great vacation spots. Take a 3, 4, or 7-day fun ship vacation on Carnival, the most popular cruise line in the world.
If after test driving a Sterling, you find another car with all of its standard features and appointments for $28,500 or less, we'll do more than congratulate you. We'll buy it for you.
ABC News coverage of the Gulf War continues. Once again in Washington, Ted Koppel.
It is one of those moments of relative tranquility in what has been a truly extraordinary day and a half as this war began just a day or so after the United Nations security deadline expired on January 15th. And we have been doing our best over the past 36 hours or so to keep you up to date on what is happening, sometimes almost on a moment-by-moment basis, sometimes live even as events are occurring, as was the case this evening when Dean Reynolds and Peter Jennings and some of our other colleagues were covering the Scud missile attack on Tel Aviv. That, fortunately, has turned out to be a lot less damaging than it could have been, but the repercussions of that are still in the making. It is not altogether clear whether the Israeli government will decide to respond on its own or whether it will relieve or rather rely on the United States and other allied forces to respond in their behalf. Clearly, the danger of Scud missile attacks, both against the Israelis and against Saudi Arabia, still exist. And indeed, at some point this afternoon, I was talking to the Iraqi ambassador to France, who made the point that Iraqi reaction is still in the making, that this war is far from over. And indeed, I also spoke to the chief spokesman for the Palestine Liberation Organization, who made the point this afternoon that the war had not yet begun. He seemed to be suggesting that there would be Iraqi response in a number of different ways. In one fashion, we have now seen an Iraqi response. It is much too early to believe that Iraqi responses or that the capacity to respond is beyond the capability of the Iraqi military at this point. The aerial bombardment, the aerial sorties against Iraq and against occupied Kuwait have apparently been enormously successful. But again, a word of caution, much too early to believe that the real fighting will not yet still take place. Joining me now, two of my ABC colleagues, George Will and Jeff Greenfield. And gentlemen, pick it up any way you like, because it seems to me that this is one of those pivotal events in American history, which we will be looking back on years from now. And I almost think that the way that this thing has been covered in the media and the way that the world has been connected by television with people in Damascus and Iraq and Jerusalem, quite literally watching on television reactions in the United States, and then here in the United States, members of the administration watching reaction in those other capitals, it almost makes one wonder, George, whether they have the capacity to sit down and actually engage in any strategic thinking when they seem to be engaged in so much tactical response to one another's actions and comments as filtered through the medium of television.
Well, that's a good point, Ted. And what we're seeing is that the graphic revolution in journalism that began about 120 years ago is changing forever and in ways unpredictable in their consequences, the relationship between battlefront and home front, particularly in a democracy. Let me tell you a small story. It goes back to something you said earlier about Saddam Hussein saying Americans could not